The abandonment of the Kerch Peninsula entailed measures of the High Command which were not justified and which, in the interests of our brave soldiers, must be considered here. The then Commander-in-Chief of Army Group South, Field Marshal General von Reichenau, first of all forbade the presentation of any awards to the personnel of the 46th Army Group. This measure was apparently a consequence of a categorical order of Hitler, who, taking command of the ground forces in December 1941, forbade them to retreat back even one step, regardless of the situation. Yet with regard to this division, such a measure was not justified. It received the order to withdraw from the Corps headquarters and was obliged to fulfill it. Unfortunately, only after the death of General Feldmarschall von Reichenau, which followed shortly afterwards, did I succeed in getting his successor, General Feldmarschall von Bock, to rescind this decision, which was an injustice to such a brave unit. So the commander of the division, Lieutenant General Geimer, unfortunately died soon after in the defensive battles on the Isthmus of Parpacha. So the case of Count Sponeck shows how tragic for a military commander can be a collision between the duty to fulfill orders and his own opinion about operational necessity. He knows that by disobeying an order he risks his head, and yet he may find himself faced with the necessity of acting contrary to the order. Such a collision in all its acuteness is only possible for a soldier. Having received a report that, despite repeated orders from the army commander prohibiting withdrawal from the Kerch Peninsula, the corps commander still ordered his troops to withdraw, I removed Count Sponeck from command. I did not do this because he acted arbitrarily. I myself was often enough forced to act contrary to Hitler's operational instructions to realize that my subordinate commanders, if necessary, have the right to act as they see fit. I removed Sponeck from command because I was not sure that he was able to cope with the critical situation on the Kerch Peninsula at that time. In the heavy battles for the Dnieper, he had to endure the most severe strain in his time. In his place, I appointed the well-proven commander of the 72nd Guards, General Mattenclot. Count Sponeck, of course, wished to justify his course of action in a trial by court-martial. Such a trial was ordered by Hitler, for which purpose Sponeck was summoned to the Führer's headquarters. The trial took place in the Führer's headquarters under the chairmanship of Göring in the days when the situation in the Crimea was most acute. After a brief trial, a death sentence was passed, commuted, however, by Hitler to imprisonment in a fortress. The army staff was not informed of the date of the trial, nor was I given an opportunity to give my assessment of Count Sponeck's behavior. In order to evaluate this case objectively, it is necessary to say the following. As a mitigating circumstance of Count Sponeck's guilt, it must necessarily have been recognized that he found himself in an extremely difficult position. Although the army command had forbidden to leave the Kerch Peninsula, still the Soviet landing at Feodosia created a new situation. One cannot but recognize the logical idea that now the main task was to preserve the combat strength of the 46th Army by its rapid withdrawal to the Isthmus of Parpacha. Undoubtedly, Count Sponeck was guided by this thought. However, it could not be approved that the headquarters of the 42nd Army, with its radiogram about the already given order to withdraw, had put the Army command in front of the accomplished fact, and also that it, by folding its radio, made impossible any intervention on the part of the Army command aimed at cancelling such a decision. In addition, it must be said that such an overly hasty withdrawal of the 46th PD could not contribute to the preservation of its combat effectiveness. If to leave the Kerch Peninsula, it was necessary to make every effort to ensure that the division reached the Isthmus of Parpacha in a combat-ready condition. If the enemy at Feodosia had acted correctly, the division in the condition in which it reached Parpacha would hardly have been able to make its way westward. Be that as it may, a court-martial composed of experienced frontline commanders would not have passed the same sentence as the court presided over by Göring. As a mitigating circumstance of Count Sponeck's guilt, it had to be taken into account that he, caught in an extremely difficult situation, was deeply convinced that it was impossible to do otherwise. In addition, the fact that he had distinguished himself as commander of the 22nd PD at Rotterdam and at the forcing of the Dnieper at Berislav should have excluded the possibility of such a sentence. As soon as I learned of the verdict, I interceded for Count Sponeck in a report to the commander of the army group and demanded that, first of all, I should be heard once again. Field Marshal General von Bock fully supported my position. However, we received only Kittel's reply, in a completely unjustifiably harsh form, rejecting our point of view. Still, Hitler, as stated above, changed the verdict. The following years General Count Sponeck had to spend in the fortress of Germersheim. My repeated attempts to get him fully rehabilitated were unsuccessful. Then he was despicably shot on Himmler's order after July 20, 1944. But this fact became known only after the end of the war. All of us who knew him will respectfully keep the memory of him as an honest soldier and a commander filled with a high sense of responsibility. But let's return to the situation of the 11th Army. In the first days of January 1942, for the enemy troops landed at Feodosia and approached from Kerch, actually opened the way to the vital artery of the 11th Army, the railroad Shankoi-Simferopol weak front guarding which we managed to create could not resist the onslaught of large forces. January 4, it became known that the enemy in the area of Feodosia was already 6 divisions, until the divisions arrive. Pulled up from under Sevastopol, the fate of the 11th Army really hung in the balance. However, the enemy tried to prevent the withdrawal of troops from the Sevastopol front, now going on the offensive on our new and insufficiently fortified positions. In these days, we were morally especially depressed by the fact that in the hospitals of Simferopol lay 10,000 wounded, which we could not evacuate. In Feodosia, the Bolsheviks killed our wounded who were in the hospitals there, and some of them, lying in plaster, they dragged them to the seashore, poured water on them, and froze them in the icy wind. What would have happened if the weak front of our guard west of Feodosia was broken through? And in general, everything seemed to conspire against us. Heavy frost at the airfields near Simferopol and Eupatoria, from which our bombers were to rise, often prevented the start of aircraft for raids on the places of unloading the enemy in Feodosia. We have previously mentioned that the enemy was able to cross the Kerch Strait on the ice. On the other hand, bomber aviation formations based in the area of Kherson and Nikolaev also could not take to the air because of unfavorable weather in the area. Due to difficulties with transportation in the past weeks, it was not possible to provide for the horses, in addition to oats, also coarse fodder. This shortage led to the fact that the horse unit standing on the southern coast near Sevastopol, where there was no coarse fodder, was severely depleted, and there was a large number of horse casualties. For example, all artillery on horse-drawn 170 PD could overcome the mountains between Alushta and Simferopol only without guns. The guns had to be transported by motor transport. In this connection, I would like to make one remark on another matter. Despite all the above difficulties with supply, the Army made every effort, up to the point of reducing the allowances of its troops, in order to at least somehow provide food for the numerous prisoners who could not be sent to the rear because of the lack of transportation. As a result, the average annual mortality rate among them did not reach even 2%, a figure which seems very low when we consider that a large proportion of the prisoners fell into our hands badly wounded or in a completely exhausted condition. Proof that we treated the prisoners well was their own behavior during the Soviet landing at Feodosia. There was a camp there with 8,000 prisoners whose guards had fled. However, these 8,000 people did not rush into the arms of their liberators, but, on the contrary, marched without guards in the direction of Simferopol, that is, to us. On top of that, the Army did everything in its power to help the civilian population. They endured severe hardships because the Soviets, before leaving the Crimea, with the help of specially created extermination battalions, which were part of skillfully organized partisan detachments, not only destroyed almost all factories, mills, etc., but also destroyed most of the available food stores. It should be taken into account that Crimea always imported food from other regions. Colonel Gauck, the chief of the rear of the army, and Rabus, the intendant of the army, who coped well with his duties, in spite of all the difficulties with supply, also did a decent job in solving this problem. Success of this assistance, as well as the respect for the religious customs of the Tatars on our part, led to the fact that the majority of the Tatar population of the Crimea was very friendly towards us. We even managed to form armed self-defense companies from the Tatars, whose task was to protect their villages from attacks by partisans hiding in the Yala Mountains. The reason that a powerful partisan movement developed in Crimea from the very beginning, which caused us a lot of trouble, was that among the population of Crimea, in addition to the Tatars and other small national groups, there were still many Russians. Some of them had been settled in the Crimea only under the Bolshevik regime. From them, as well as from numerous servicemen of the units scattered in the first battles and recruited mainly partisans. Partisan movement in the Crimea was prepared in advance. in the inaccessible mountains of the Yala guerrillas had shelters and prepared stores of food and ammunition which were difficult to approach. Based on them, they tried to block the few roads. Just at the time of the events covered here, when the situation was very tense, and even all the Romanian mountain troops were thrown to the front, the partisans posed a serious threat. At times, movement on the roads was only possible with an escort. In general, the partisans, as elsewhere in the east, fought with extreme perfidy and cruelty. They did not respect any norms of international law. To protect our troops as well as the civilian population, we had no choice but to deal with each captured guerrilla according to the laws of wartime. What a danger they represented, and how well prepared their organization was, became especially clear in the critical days of early January, when no one could not yet foresee whether it would be possible to cope at all with the mortal danger to the 11th Army resulting from the landing operations at Kerch and Feodosia. The Russians struck again. On January 5 followed a new landing of Russian troops under the cover of the fleet in the port of Eupatoria. At the same time, a rebellion broke out in the city, in which part of the population participated, as well as infiltrated, apparently, from outside partisans. The small guard force assigned to defend the city and port was unable to prevent the landing and suppress the uprising. The Romanian artillery regiment assigned to coastal defense abandoned its positions. If it had not been possible to immediately eliminate this new hotbed of fire, if the Russians had been able to land new troops here by transferring them from nearby Sevastopol, no one could vouch for the consequences. Although the situation on the Feodosia section was very serious, the Army Command had to make up its mind to turn the 1st Regiment, which was going there by automobile from the southern front from near Sevastopol, and send it to Eupatoria with the task to destroy, as soon as possible, the troops landed there, and the armed elements from the population supporting them. The reconnaissance battalion of 22 PD, several batteries and 70 sapper battalion, which were at the disposal of the Army Command, had already been sent to Eupatoria earlier. Sent to Eupatoria units, first under the command of Colonel von Heigl, and then Colonel Muller managed to win over the enemy in heavy street battles. Particularly stubborn resistance was offered by the insurgents and partisans, who had taken up residence in a large building. There was finally nothing left but to blow up this building with the help of assault groups of sappers. In the battles in Eupatoria, along with many brave soldiers, fell to the death of a hero, and the commander of the 22nd Reconnaissance Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel von Bodin, one of our bravest officers and fervently loved by the soldiers of the commander. He was shot in the back by partisans who were in ambush. January 7, the battle in Eupatoria was over. The Russian troops that had landed were partly destroyed, partly taken prisoner. About 1,200 armed partisans were killed. Meanwhile, our weak front near Feodosia somehow miraculously held. However, approaching from near Sevastopol, 2 divisions could enter into action no sooner than a week. In addition, the Army Command transferred from the southern front, from under Sevastopol 30 AC, to launch a counterattack on Feodosia. Under Sevastopol at this time, without such a counterattack, as a last resort, could do without. As command of the corps, instead of seriously ill with jaundice, General von Saumute took General Fretterp. Meanwhile, the enemy landed in Feodosia new troops as well as pulling up fresh forces through Kerch. At the same time, on the Sevastopol front, where the front of the encirclement now held only 4 German divisions and 1 Romanian mountain brigade, the situation became very tense due to enemy counterattacks from the fortress. Finally, January 15, everything was ready for a counterattack on Feodosia forces 30 and 42 AC. It was still not easy to decide on this offensive. It was to be conducted by 3.5 German divisions and 1 Romanian mountain brigade against the enemy, whose forces had now increased to 8 divisions and 2 brigades. While the enemy had tanks, albeit in limited numbers, we had none. Air support was in doubt because of the inclement weather. Nevertheless, an offensive had to be decided upon. Thanks to the bravery of the troops, among which, along with the 105th PP, the 213th PP with its proven commander, Colonel Gitzfeld, especially distinguished itself. The offensive was a success. The regiment distinguished itself in due time already at the storming of the Tater Moat and at the capture of Kerch. By January 18, Feodosia was in our hands. The enemy lost 6,700 men killed, 10,000 prisoners, 177 guns and 85 tanks. Aviation, as we have now seen, despite the unfavorable weather, worked well in Feodosia port and sank several transports. A new small landing, landed these days by the enemy in Sudak, west of Feodosia, was also eliminated. After the success at Feodosia, the question naturally arose as to whether it would be possible to utilize this success immediately for the purpose of finally liberating the Kerch Peninsula from the Soviet armies. Although this was highly desirable, the Army Command, after mature reflection, still had to come to the conclusion that the achievement of this goal with the forces available at that time is impossible, especially since the tank battalion promised to the Army, as well as 2 bombing squadrons, had to be transferred to Army Group South. These forces would have been especially needed to accomplish this task. Thus, the Army Command was forced to abandon the full use of success, and limited to the fact that the enemy was pushed back to the Isthmus of Parpatia. Here, the army could cut off the Kerch Peninsula at its narrowest point between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. Certainly it was not timidity that guided us when we decided, in this way, to limit our objective. We realized that after all that we had had to demand of the troops, new disproportionate demands could lead to grievous setback. The Stalinist offensive continued. Despite the fact that by regaining Feodosia and blocking the Kerch Peninsula on the Isthmus of Parpatia, the 11th Army avoided the mortal danger that threatened it, we still did not entertain the illusion that the enemy would now leave us alone. All along the Eastern Front, he was at this time trying to eliminate the consequences of his summer defeats and seize the initiative. Why should he not try to do the same in the Crimea, especially since the dominance of the sea gave him special advantages here? After all, success in this area would be of great political importance, because it would have an impact on the position of Turkey, and of great military and economic importance, because the capture of air bases in the Crimea for raids on the Romanian oil areas would have a decisive influence on the entire situation on the Eastern Front. Finally, in enemy propaganda, the offensive in the Crimea was so closely associated with the name of Stalin that abandoning it seemed unlikely. We found that the enemy is pulling up new forces on the Kerch Peninsula, having the Kerch Ice Road. He did not particularly affected by the loss of Feodosia port, where reconnaissance constantly detected large concentrations of enemy forces in the ports of the Black Sea coast, as well as on the airfields of the North Caucasus. Already on January 29, intelligence data said that the enemy still, or rather, again has on the Parpatia section of 9 divisions, 2 rifle brigades and 2 tank brigades. And on the Sevastopol section, the enemy's activity, especially the activity of his artillery, again increased. We were already forced to wait and at both sites to prepare everything for a hot reception of the enemy, in case he goes on the offensive. Although the OK realized the predicament of our situation, it could not help us in any way, due to the employment of all the forces on the rest of the Eastern Front. Marshal Antonescu, however, provided us with 2 more Romanian infantry divisions. Of these, 10 PD was used to protect the western coast of Crimea, especially the port of Eupatoria. 18 PD we put on the northern flank of the Parpatia sector. We expected that, flanked by the Sea of Azov, it would be able to hold its position, especially since the swampy terrain in front of its front made it unlikely that the enemy would use large forces. After several outwardly calm, in reality tense to the extreme weeks, the enemy on February 27 began. Finally, expected by us a major offensive. On the Sevastopol front, he tried to break out to the north and east through a loose ring of encirclement 54 German divisions and 1 Romanian mountain brigade. He could already oppose in the fortress area 7 infantry divisions, 3 brigades and 1 cavalry division without horses. The artillery of these divisions was supplemented by fortress artillery, partly located in armoured towns. The enemy attacks, made mainly in the bands of the Lower Saxon 22 PD and Saxon 24 PD, were repulsed in hard fighting thanks to the excellent actions of our troops and effective fire of artillery. On the Parpatia section, the enemy launched an offensive against the 30 AC, X and 42X standing there with the forces of 7 rifle divisions, 2 brigades and several tank battalions, another 6 or 7 rifle divisions, 2 tank brigades and 1 cavalry division were in the second echelon and were to be put into action to exploit the breakthrough achieved. So the German divisions managed to repel the enemy attacks, but the 18th Romanian PD did not resist. In doing so, we also lost 2 German artillery divisions operating in its strip. We had no other choice but to throw into the fight our reserve, 213 PP, and remove from the southern flank of this front headquarters 170 PD and 105 PP, to eliminate the enemy breakthrough in the north. However, these units, with their heavy weapons, advanced so slowly because of the deep mud that the enemy managed to break through to the west as far as Kerch, by which he practically secured the possibility of getting through the Isthmus of Parpatia to the north. The Romanian division was withdrawn from the battle. Steady fighting continued with unrelenting intensity both here and near Sevastopol until March 3. But then came a pause caused by fatigue on both sides. On the Parpatia section still managed to block the way of the enemy who had broken through in the north, taking advantage of the swampy terrain. The enemy was so displaced that it was again possible to create a continuous front, although it was deflected in the north in an arc far to the west. On March 13, the enemy again launched a major offensive. This time, in its first echelon, attacked 8 rifle divisions and 2 tank brigades. From the composition of the latter during the first 3 days of the offensive managed to hit 136 tanks. Nevertheless, at a number of sites created a critical situation. The fact that the regiments of the 46th PD, in the band of which the main strike was made, during the first 3 days repulsed from 10 to 22 attacks, testifies to how persistent the fighting was. On March 18, the headquarters of the 42nd Corps had to report that the corps was unable to withstand another major enemy offensive. Meanwhile, behind this front, the newly formed 22 TD sent by the OK was positioned. Given the extreme tension of the situation, the Army Command decided to use this division for a counterattack. The purpose of the counterattack was to restore the former front line along the isthmus, and at the same time to cut off 2-3 enemy divisions, which had cut into our front in the north. With the officers of the task force of the headquarters again went to the forward CP, near the threatened Parpatia section to personally observe the preparation for counterattack conducted by the headquarters of the 42nd Army. The offensive undertaken on March 20, which was also to be joined on the flanks of the 46th and 170th PDs, failed. Tank division in the morning fog ran into the Soviet troops who took the initial position for the offensive. It turned out that the Army Command had made the mistake of throwing this newly formed division into a big fight without having tested it beforehand, and without having conducted exercises with it as part of the compound. Although this time the division's offensive was not successful, despite the fact that it had been assigned a limited task. A few weeks later, when it was trained in near-combat conditions as part of a compound, it fully justified the expectations placed on it. But what could we do in this extremely tense situation? How not to take the risk and throw into battle tank division? Still, the enemy was dealt a moral blow, and we disrupted his preparations for a new major offensive at a crucial moment. Now, the offensive was undertaken by him only on March 26, and it was repulsed by 42. The enemy this time sent to the offensive only 4 divisions. Either the striking power of the rest of his compounds was, at least temporarily, exhausted, or in view of the first case of the use of tanks on our part, he preferred to be content with a limited task. Meanwhile, when 22 TD was withdrawn to the rear for replenishment, behind our front appeared the first units of the newly arrived 28 LPD. Now we could calmly await the enemy offensive. It was undertaken as the last attempt of the enemy to regain the Crimea on April 9 by the forces of 6-8 infantry divisions supported by 160 tanks. By April 11, it was repulsed with heavy losses for the enemy. The enemy's striking power was now finally exhausted. The brave divisions that had endured this defensive battle, despite the inhuman strain of their strength, could now rest, although there was no possibility of withdrawing them from the front line. As for the Army Command, it began after a hard, brought many crises winter to its next task, to prepare an offensive to finally expel the Soviet troops from the Crimea. Bustard hunt. The return of the Kerch Peninsula. Even during the respite between the penultimate and last defensive battles, Romanian head of state Antonescu arrived in the Crimea. Together with me, he visited the Romanian divisions and the Sevastopol front. As a military commander, he made a wonderful impression on me, especially his manner of holding himself. The higher Romanian officers seemed to fear him as God himself. Especially valuable to me was the fact that he promised us 2 more Romanian divisions, especially since the OK could not provide us with any other forces for the proposed offensive, except for the already arrived 22 TD and 28 LPD. According to the plan of the OK, the final expulsion of Soviet troops from the Crimea, including Sevastopol, was to constitute the beginning of a major offensive planned by the General Command on the southern segment of the Eastern Front. It was clear that the immediate objective of the 11th Army was to destroy the enemy forces on the Kerch Peninsula, first of all because it was impossible to predict how long it would take for the offensive to take Sevastopol, but most importantly because the Kerch front, where the enemy could most easily throw up new forces, was still the main threat to the 11th Army. Here the enemy could not give time to recover from their losses suffered in the failed offensive. Sevastopol was to be relegated to the background until the destruction of the enemy on the Kerch Peninsula. The ratio of forces in the Crimea, however, did not give much reason for optimism about the fulfillment of both major tasks. Under the command of the apparently newly created headquarters of the Crimean Front, located, according to our data, in Kerch, in the Crimea were 3 enemy armies. Fortress Sevastopol was still defended by the Maritime Army, which in February consisted, according to our data, of 7 rifle divisions, 1 rifle brigade, 2 brigades of Marines and 1 cavalry division. Against these forces we could leave during the planned offensive on the Kerch Peninsula only 54 AC, holding the northern and eastern sections in front of the fortress, as well as the newly arrived Romanian 19 PD. It was to release for the Kerch front German 50 PD. In the southern section near Sevastopol remained only 72 PD. The Romanian Mountain Corps was to provide the 4 Mountain Brigade for the entire southern coast of Crimea against possible surprise enemy attacks. In order to carry out the proposed offensive on Kerch as large forces as possible, the Army Command again had to denude the remaining areas. On the Kerch front, the enemy still held its 44th and 51st Armies. Their total composition was equal to the end of April 17 infantry divisions, 3 infantry brigades, cavalry divisions and 4 tank brigades, that is, a total of 26 large compounds. These forces the Army Command could oppose no more than 5 German infantry divisions and 1 armoured division. To them were added, still included in the newly arrived Romanian Sponeck 19 Romanian Division and 8 Romanian Cavalry Brigade, as well as transferred from the West Coast 10 Romanian Division. Since the Romanian formations were only conditionally suitable for offensive action, the balance of forces in the planned operation, codenamed Bustard Hunt, was actually even worse. In addition, the offensive on the Isthmus of Parpacha was to be conducted only front. Both seas excluded any possibility of flank maneuver. In addition, the enemy created a deeply echeloned defense. How was it possible in these conditions and with a ratio of forces 2-1 in favor of the enemy to achieve the destruction of his 2 armies? It was clear that by pushing back the enemy only frontally, or even just making a breakthrough, we could not achieve the goal. If the enemy managed, after he left the Parpacha position, again somewhere to take up defences, our offensive would be smothered. As the Kerch Peninsula expanded eastward, the enemy would be increasingly better able to exploit his numerical superiority. Our 6 German divisions would have been enough for the offensive on the 18-kilometre isthmus at Parpacha, where the enemy could not simultaneously put into battle all their forces. But how would the operation develop if we had to fight further east on a front of 40 kilometres, where the enemy could fully exploit his numerical superiority? The task, therefore, was not only to break through the enemy's front on the isthmus and then move further inland, but, above all, to destroy the enemy's main forces, or at least most of them, in the course of the breakthrough. In this regard, the enemy himself provided us with favourable conditions. In the southern section of his front, between the Black Sea and the village Koi Asan, he was still largely occupying his old, well-equipped Parpacha frontier, for all his attacks in that section had been repulsed. In the northern section, however, its front diverged in a great arc westward to Kerch, extending far beyond this front. This front was formed at the time when the enemy knocked out of position the 18th Romanian Division. The grouping of enemy forces indicated that the Soviet command considered the possibility of attempts on our part to cut off the troops located on this arc. Our reconnaissance showed that the enemy has concentrated 2/3 of its forces in the northern section. On the southern section of the defence occupied only 3 divisions, and another 2-3 divisions made up the reserve. It would not be wrong to assume that such a distribution of enemy forces was due to the failure in its time offensive 22 TD, which had the task to cut the bend of the enemy's front in the area of Khorasan. This situation was the basis on which the Army headquarters developed a plan of Operation Bustard Hunt. The plan was to strike a decisive blow not directly on the outstanding forward arc of the enemy's front, but in the southern section, along the Black Sea coast, that is, in the place where the enemy apparently least of all expected it. This task was entrusted to 30 AK, consisting of 28 LPD, 132 and 50 PD, as well as 22 T. 170 PD, which at first was to remain in the central section in order to mislead the enemy, later was to move after the advancing troops in the southern section. The Corps was to break through the position on the isthmus of Parpacha with all 3 infantry divisions in the first echelon. Its immediate task was to seize the bridgehead on the other side of the anti-tank ditch and thus provide 22nd TD with the opportunity to overcome the ditch. Then he had to turn to the northeast and later to the north to hit in the flank and rear of the main enemy forces, occupying the defences in the northern section, as well as being there in reserve, and surround them near the northern coast of the peninsula in cooperation with 42 AC and Romanian 7. Cover formed in this manoeuvre of the open eastern flank of the Corps. Against a possible enemy attack, from Kerch was assigned to a motorized compound, Grudek's Brigade, composed of German and Romanian motorized units. So the brigade was to ensure the fulfillment of this task through offensive actions, moving quickly in the direction of Kerch, to simultaneously cut off the escape route to the rear positions of the retreating enemy units. In order to facilitate the difficult task of breaking through the Parpacha frontier, the Army Command, perhaps for the first time, decided to conduct a naval landing operation with the help of assault boats. It was decided to transfer at dawn by sea, by assault boats from Feodosia 1 battalion of infantry to the rear of the Parpacha frontier. Decisive offensive of the Corps was to be supported, in addition to large forces of artillery, and the 8th Air Corps in full strength. The 8th Air Corps, which the command had at its disposal to support the operations of ground troops, also had a large force of anti-aircraft artillery. It was the most powerful compound of the Air Force, possessing a large strike force. Its commander, Baron von Richthofen, it is safe to say, was the best of the air commanders in World War II. He not only made very great demands on his subordinate formations, but also personally supervised their every important operation in the. He could always be found in the forward land army formations at the front, where he personally explored the possibilities of supporting land operations. Our interactions with him both in 11th Army and later in Army Group Don and South were always excellent. I recall his personal successes and those of his Air Corps with great admiration and gratitude. It was also a pleasure to work with his Chief of Staff, Colonel Christ. On the rest of the front, the 42nd AC and the Romanian 7th ERK were to make an offensive demonstration at first to stiffen the enemy forces, immediately after the breakthrough of the Parpacha frontier in the south, and these corps were to go on the offensive. The success of the operation depended on 2 preconditions. Firstly, on whether we would be able to keep the enemy in a delusion about the direction of the main blow, namely, that it was being applied ostensibly in the northern section, until the enemy would miss the opportunity to get out of the encirclement or to transfer their reserves to the southern section. Second, on the speed with which the northward advance of 30 AC, and especially 22 TD, would. The first premise was provided by an extensive system of measures aimed at misleading the enemy, in addition to the demonstration of preparations for the offensive through false radio conversations. It was envisaged primarily false artillery preparations in the northern and central sections, as well as the movement of troops in these same sections. Apparently, these measures were a complete success, as the main enemy reserves were behind his northern flank until it was too late. As for the pace of the 30-acre operation, it seemed at times that the weather god was again going to side with the enemy. Just on the eve of the beginning of the offensive, we had to part with our tried and tested Chief of Staff, General Wheeler, who had been such a valuable assistant to me during the hard days of winter and who had taken a leading part in the preparation of the Operation Bustard hunt. It was especially hard for us to part, because we finally had the opportunity to take the initiative again. But Wheeler was appointed Chief of Staff of Army Group Center, and I, of course, could not in any way to prevent his promotion. Wheeler's successor was General Schultz, and he became a faithful friend and advisor to me. During the most difficult situation in the winter campaign of 1944, in the days of the loss of the 6th Army, he was a particularly valuable assistant to me. This bravest man was characterized by iron nerves. He perfectly understood the needs of the troops and always remained equally kind. Even earlier, as a division commander, he was awarded the Knight's Cross for leading combat operations in a very difficult situation. Later, already commanding a corps on the front of Army Group South, he stood like a cliff in the surf. May 8. The Army began the offensive according to the plan of Operation Bustard Hunt. 30 AC managed to overcome the anti-tank ditch and break through the first position of the enemy. Landing from the sea well helped the troops advancing on the flank, as it caught the enemy by surprise. But still the battle was not easy. The bridgehead captured on the other side of the anti-tank ditch was insufficient to end the advance of the tank division. The 42 AC offensive, which began later, was also advancing only slowly. But nevertheless, we have already engaged in battle with 10 divisions of the enemy and defeated his southern flank. Reserves of the enemy, by all accounts, continued to remain behind his northern flank. On May 9, we were already able to pull up 22-2D, and it took the initial position for the offensive. When it was about to turn north, it first had to repel a strong attack by enemy tanks. Then it began to rain, continued all the next night, almost eliminating the actions of short-range bombers and making it almost impossible for the tanks to advance on May 10 in the morning. Only in the afternoon of May 10, the weather cleared up and the advance resumed. But still, because of the fact that the entire operation depended on the pace of the advance, this 24-hour delay could prove fatal. We were comforted by the fact that Grodek's brigade advanced quickly before the rain began, thanks to which it was able to thwart all attempts of the enemy to gain a foothold in the rear positions. Apparently, the enemy had not expected such a bold breakthrough deep into his rear area. Unfortunately, the brave Colonel Grodek, who was entrusted with the command of the brigade, was severely wounded during this operation and died soon afterward. Beginning on May 11, the operation proceeded without significant delays. 22 TD rushed to the northern coast. Approximately 8 enemy divisions were in the cauldron created by it. The Army Command could now give the order to pursue the enemy. The pursuit was carried out by all units, including Romanian, with maximum effort. On May 16, Kerch was taken by 170 PD and 213 PP, but it still required heavy local fighting to destroy the remnants of the enemy forces that had reached the eastern coast. Before the offensive, I again arranged a forward CP in close proximity to the front and spent whole days touring the divisions and troops on the front line. In a soldier, this rapid pursuit left a lasting impression. All roads were clogged with abandoned vehicles, tanks, and enemy guns. At every step to meet long columns of prisoners. An unforgettable sight opened from a height near the city of Kerch, where we met with General von Richthofen. Before us, in the rays of the shining sun, lay the sea, the Kerch Strait and the opposite shore. The goal we had so long dreamed of had been reached. In front of us was the shore, on which stood an untold number of different machines. The Soviet gunboats were making more and more attempts to approach the shore to take at least men on board, but ours drove them away with fire. In order to achieve the surrender of the last remnants of the enemy forces desperately defending on the shore, and to avoid unnecessary casualties on the part of our infantry, the fire of all artillery was concentrated on these last strongholds. On May 18, the Battle of the Kerch Peninsula was over. Only small detachments of the enemy, under the pressure of a few fanatical commissars, were still held for several weeks in underground caves in the cliffs near Kerch. We reportedly captured about 170,000 prisoners, 1133 guns and 258 tanks. 5 German infantry divisions and 1 tank division, as well as 2 Romanian infantry divisions and 1 cavalry brigade destroyed 2 armies, which included 26 major formations. Only a negligible number of enemy troops managed to escape through the strait to the Taman Peninsula. Our troops once again did the incredible. Their success largely depended on the actions of the 8th Aviation Corps. A real battle of annihilation was victoriously ended. The army still had the most difficult task, the capture of the fortress of Sevastopol. My thoughts on the conduct of the offensive on the fortress, as well as the plans for the Kerch offensive, I reported to Hitler in mid-April in the Führer's headquarters. Since I gave him my thoughts on the conduct of the offensive in the West in February 1940, I met with him for the first time as the commander of a large group of troops. And at this meeting I had the impression that he was not only very accurately informed about all the details of the past battles, but that he also perfectly understood the operational considerations reported to him. He listened attentively to my explanations and fully approved of the intentions of the Army Command, with regard to both the Kerch offensive and the attack on the fortress of Sevastopol. He made no attempt at all to influence our decision in any way or, as often happened afterwards, to go into an endless enumeration of figures characterizing our production. One question of principle, however, was not discussed at that time. Was it justified, having in mind the planned offensive in the Ukraine, to delay the entire 11th Army indefinitely to attack the powerful fortress of Sevastopol, especially after the threat to the Crimea had been eliminated thanks to the victory on the Kerch Peninsula? To decide this question was undoubtedly a matter for the General Command, not for the Army Command. I personally at that time adhered to the opinion, and now I adhere to the opinion that the task given to the 11th Army at that time to take Sevastopol was correct. If we further limited ourselves to the blockade of the fortress in the Crimea would still be bound, in addition to the Romanian troops, at least 3-4 German divisions, that is, half of the 11th Army. However, without any doubt can be considered a mistake that after Sevastopol was taken in time, the General Command removed the 11th Army from the southern flank of the Eastern Front in order to use it at Leningrad and to fill gaps in the front. After the capture of Sevastopol, the 11th Army should have been transferred, as was initially assumed, through the Kerch Strait to the Kuban, to cut off the retreat of the enemy forces that were retreating in front of Army Group A from the lower Don to the Caucasus. Or if it could not be done in time, it should have been, at any rate, kept in reserve behind the southern flank. The Stalingrad tragedy could have been avoided. Immediately after the completion of the fighting at Kerch, the Army Command began to regroup forces for the offensive on Sevastopol. The 42nd Army was entrusted with guarding the Kerch Peninsula, and to fulfill this task at his disposal remained of the German troops only 46 PD, as well as 7 Romanian ACs in the 10 and 19 PD, 4 Mountain Division and 8 Cavalry Brigade. All other forces were immediately sent to Sevastopol. It was clear that the offensive on the fortress will be even more difficult than in December last year. After all, the enemy had 6 months of time to strengthen its fortifications, replenish its formations, and bring by sea to the fortress of material reserves. The main thing that was strong fortress Sevastopol was not in the presence of modern fortress structures, although they were available in some quantity. The main factors were the extremely difficult terrain, and the fact that this terrain was reinforced by a huge number of small defences. They covered the entire area from the Belbek River Valley to the Black Sea in a dense network. Especially strongly fortified was the area between the Belbek River Valley and Sivernaya Bay, which was a solid fortified area. The northern section of the front passed south of the Belbek River. But, however, the enemy held north of the river a large stronghold near the village of Lyubimovka and the area north of it. The valley itself, as well as the mountain slopes rising in the south, were shot longitudinally by a battery of 305 mm guns equipped with the latest technology. The slopes themselves were covered with a dense network of field-type fortifications, including concrete long-term structures extending to a depth of up to 2 kilometers. Then followed a series of well-fortified, mostly concreted strongholds, called by us Stalin, Volga, Siberia, Molotov, Jipu, Shika. All of them were linked together by a chain of field installations. The third strip, which consisted of the strongholds Donetsk, Volga, Lenin, as well as the Bartenyevka settlement equipped as a stronghold, the old Seveny fort and coastal batteries on the Cape Batarini, was the last line of defence, covering the approaches to the northern steep shore of Seveny Bay. In the rocks of the shore at a depth of 30 metres were cut-out rooms for ammunition and reserve warehouses. The eastern section of the front began about 2 kilometers east of the village of Belbek by turning the front line to the south. The junction of both sections was covered by the deep and steep Kamishlinsky Gorge. Further, the northern flank of the eastern section passed through dense bushes covering steep heights, which were spurs of the Yaila. In these thickets of bushes were located many small long-term structures, including those carved in the rocks, almost invulnerable to the artillery of the advancing. This northern section through the forest ended on steep heights, south and southeast of the village of Gateny. Farther south there were no more forests, but the terrain became less and less accessible and turned into rocky mountains near the shore. South of the river Chernaya, the approaches to the southern fortified area on both sides of the south coastal road to Sevastopol were covered by a number of steep peaks, turned by the Soviets into powerful strongholds. They are known to the participants of the battles in the Crimea under the names Sugarhead, Northern Nose, mountain with a chapel and hill with ruins. Next came the heavily fortified village of Kamary, and finally the rock massif northeast of Balaklava Bay. Here the enemy managed to hold on, when in the fall of 1941 105th PP took the Fort Balaclava with a bold rush. It was especially difficult to break through this strip of fortified rocks and peaks, because from one mountain there could always be flanking fire on the slopes of the other. Behind this first line of defence in the southern section north of the road rose the massif of Feodosia Heights. This line continued further south to the coastal mountains, with such strongholds as Eagle Height and the fortified village of Kadikovka. All of them formed, if I may say so, a security strip for the enemy's most powerful position on Sapul. This is a steeply precipitous to the east ridge of heights, which, starting from the rocks near Inkerman, dominates over the valley of the river Chernaya, going south beyond the village of Gatany. Then this mountain range turns to the south, as if blocking the road to Sevastopol. It meets the coast through the height of the windmill, which is the western end of the coastal mountains. Because of the steep slopes and good conditions for flanking fire, this position was almost invulnerable to infantry. From the artillery stations located on it, the whole area of the fortress could be viewed at a great distance. Incidentally, during the Crimean War, the Western powers held the Sapuna frontier during their offensive to cover the rear against the idle Russian army, whose task was to unblock Sevastopol. But even after the capture of these commanding heights, the offensive still had no free way to advance. Near the shore was located a number of coastal batteries, including a modern battery of turret guns Maxim Gorky Liu. Further on, a large semicircle was a continuous position, starting from Inkerman on the shore of Severnaya Bay and ending west of the city at Strelitskaya Bay. It consisted of an anti-tank ditch, wire barriers, and numerous long-term structures. It also included an old English cemetery from the Crimean War, which was turned into a fortified artillery firing position located southeast of the city. Further, the last line of fortifications ran along the very edge of the city, and the Chersonese Peninsula was also covered from the east by a number of positions crossing it. While the Russians had long been known for their ability to equip and camouflage field fortifications, the terrain near Sevastopol also provided them with excellent opportunities for flanking firing points. Moreover, the rocky ground allowed such narrow concealments for mortars and other heavy weapons, as well as for guns, that they could practically be destroyed only by a direct hit. As always with the Soviets, minefields were created not only in front of the various defensive lines, but also in the depths of the defences. Assessing the possibilities of conducting an offensive against this fortified area, the Army Command came to basically the same conclusions as last year. The central section of the front was not suitable for a decisive offensive. Fighting in the wooded area would require too many casualties, because here the actions of artillery and aviation, which were the main trump card in our hands, could never become sufficiently effective. It remained only to conduct an offensive from the north and northeast, as well as in the southern part of the eastern section. In this case, the main blow, at least in the first stage, was to be struck from the north. If the positions in the northern part of the fortified area, north of Severnaya Bay, were clearly more powerful and numerous than in the south, the terrain here, on the contrary, was much more accessible. And most importantly, effective artillery and air operations were possible on a much larger scale in the north than in the south. But it was also clear that the offensive in the south could not be abandoned. First, it was necessary to achieve dispersal of enemy forces, attacking him simultaneously from different sides. Secondly, it was necessary to keep in mind that, even having lost part of the fortified area behind the base Severnaya, the enemy will try to hold on to the city itself and on the Chersonese Peninsula. We must not forget that the Sevastopol operation was not only about the attack on the fortress, but also about actions against the army, the number of which was at least equal to the number of the advancing forces, if in terms of equipment it was inferior to us. For us, however, were no longer decisive considerations that guided us in the winter, namely, the desire to seize control of the port as soon as possible. While the 11th Army was attached to the 8th Air Corps, the enemy was deprived of the possibility of unimpeded transportation by sea. The above considerations formed the basis of the operation, which was codenamed Sturgeon Catch. The army intended to conduct an offensive in the northern and southern parts of the eastern section, simultaneously restraining the enemy in the center in the section Mackenzia, Verk, Shogun. The nearest target of the offensive in the north was the northern shore of Severnaya Bay, and the heights near the village of Gatany. In the south, the capture of the commanding heights of Sapona on both sides of the roads connecting Sevastopol with the southern coast of Crimea and Balaclava. The offensive in the north was to be led by the 54th AC in the composition of 22-24, 50 and 132 PD and reinforced 213 PP. The corps was ordered to concentrate its main forces in the direction of the main blow, on the heights north of the eastern end of Severnaya Bay. The sections of the fortified area neighbouring the attacked area were to be suppressed by fire at first, so that later their positions could be taken from the rear. The left flank of the corps had to seize the heights near the village of Gatany and southeast of it, in order to ensure that the Romanian mountain corps could later advance south of this area. So conduct of the offensive in the southern section was entrusted to 30 AC, consisting of Divisions 72, 170 and 28 Light. It had to capture first of all the initial positions and artillery NP for the subsequent offensive in the direction of Sapunra. To do this, it was necessary to seize the first line of enemy defences at the line northern nose, mountain with a chapel, hill with ruined meters of Plain Cambrai, rocky heights south of Kemery, as well as deprive the enemy of the possibility of flanking fire from the south, from the rocky heights east of Balaclava. In order to accomplish this task, 72 PD was ordered to advance on both sides of the highway to Sevastopol, and 28 Light Division to capture the northernmost ridge of rocky mountains east of Balaclava Bay. This assignment corresponded to the peculiarities of the combat use of this division. 170 PD remained in reserve for the time being. Because of the sharply rugged terrain, these tasks could only be accomplished through a series of carefully prepared offensive battles with a limited objective. Romanian Mountain Corps, operating between the two named strike groups of German troops, in the first phase of the operation, was to restrain the enemy in front of its front. The 18th Romanian Division, in particular, was to cover the advance of the left flank of the 54 AC, protecting it from flanking enemy fire from the south. To this end, it was to conduct local attacks in small forces and suppress the enemy with artillery fire. To the south, one Romanian Mountain Division was to support the offensive of the northern flank of 30 AC by capturing Sugarloaf Head. As for the artillery preparation of the offensive, the Army Command refused to fire raid, so favoured by our enemy. First, under the given terrain conditions and a huge number of enemy fortifications, such a fire did not promise decisive success. And secondly, we would not have enough ammunition for this. Instead, it was decided to begin artillery preparation 5 days before the infantry offensive with bombing strikes and powerful long-range fire attacks on the detected areas of concentration of enemy reserves and on his communications. Then the artillery was to conducting methodical corrected fire within 5 days to suppress the enemy artillery and to treat with fire the defences located on the front lines. Meanwhile, the 8th Air Corps had the task of continuously making raids on the city, port, rear and airfields. A few more words about the strength of our artillery in the offensive. The Army Command, of course, used for the offensive all available guns, and the OK put at our disposal the most powerful firepower. In all, 54 AC had, together with its constituent divisions, 56 batteries of heavy and high-power artillery, 41 batteries of light artillery, 18 mortar batteries, and 2 divisions of self-propelled artillery pieces. These 121 batteries were supported by 2 artillery-instrumented reconnaissance divisions. Among the high-power artillery batteries were cannon batteries with systems up to 190 mm caliber, and several batteries of howitzers and mortars of 305, 350, and 420 mm caliber. In addition, there were 2 special guns of 600 mm caliber and the famous Dora gun of 800 mm caliber. It was designed to destroy the most powerful structures of the Maginot Line, but it was not used there for that purpose. It was a marvel of artillery technology. The barrel was about 30 meters long, and the carriage reached the height of a 3-story house. It took about 60 railroad trains to bring this monster to the firing position on specially laid trucks. 2 divisions of anti-aircraft artillery were constantly standing ready to cover it. All in all, the expense was certainly not commensurate with the effect achieved. Nevertheless, this gun with one shot destroyed a large ammunition depot on the north shore of Severnaya Bay, concealed in the rocks at a depth of 30 meters. The 30 AC artillery was commanded by the former Austrian General Martinek, who was an outstanding artilleryman. Unfortunately, he later died on the Eastern Front while commanding the corps. The Corps had 25 batteries of heavy and high-power artillery, 25 batteries of light artillery, 6 mortar batteries, 1 division of self-propelled artillery pieces and 1 division of air. In addition, the Corps was assigned a 300 independent tank battalion, which was equipped with tanks carrying explosive charges controlled from a distance. Romanian Mountain Corps, to fulfill the task of restraining the enemy, had 12 heavy and 22 light batteries. A good reinforcement of artillery was that the commander of the 8th Air Corps, General von Richthofen, allocated several anti-aircraft artillery regiments to participate in ground combat. In general, in World War II, the Germans never achieved such a massive use of artillery as in the attack on Sevastopol. And yet, how insignificant this number seems in comparison with that which the Soviets considered necessary to carry out their breakthroughs in open ground. At Sevastopol, the advancing army had 208 batteries on a front of 35 kilometers, that is, barely 6 batteries per kilometer of front. In the areas where the offensive was actually conducted, this figure was, of course, several times higher. The Soviets, in their plans of offensive operations in 1945, proceeded from the calculation of 250 barrels per kilometer of the offensive front. In the last days of preparation for the offensive, I went to the southern coast for a short period of time to become more familiar with the situation in 38. Our CP was located there in a small former Moorish palace, wonderfully situated on a steep cliff above the Black Sea coast. On the last day of my stay there, for the purpose of familiarizing myself with the area, I made a trip along the southern coast to Balaclava in an Italian torpedo boat, which was the only vessel of our fleet. I had to ascertain the extent to which the coastal road, which provided all supplies to the Corps, could be viewed from the sea and shelled with corrective fire. The Soviet Black Sea Fleet did not dare to undertake this task, apparently for fear of our aviation. On the way back near Yalta, there was a misfortune. Suddenly around us whistled, crackled, snapped bullets and shells. 2 fighter planes collapsed on our boat. As they came at us from the blinding sun, we did not notice them, and the noise of the torpedo boat's powerful engines drowned out the hum of their engines. In a few seconds, 7 of the 16 men on board were killed and wounded. The boat caught fire. This was extremely dangerous as the torpedoes on the sides could explode. The commander of the boat, a young lieutenant in the Italian Navy, held up admirably. Without losing his presence of mind, he took measures to save the boat and the men. My adjutant, Pipo, jumped into the water, swam, despite the mines, to the shore, detained there, completely naked. A truck got on it to Yalta, called from their Croatian motorboat, which towed us to the port. It was a sad trip. An Italian non-commissioned officer was killed and 3 sailors were wounded. The Yalta harbour master who accompanied us, Captain First Rank von Bredow, was also killed. Having been confined to the shore as harbour master, he was so happy that at last he, an old sailor, again stepped on the deck of a warship, and here he fell with a death worthy of a sailor. At my feet lay my most faithful battle comrade, my driver Fritz Nagel, badly wounded in the thigh. The Italian lieutenant tore off his shirt to apply a tourniquet, but the bleeding from the artery could not be stopped. Fritz Nagel was from Karlsruhe and had been my driver since 1938. We had been through a lot together. He had already been wounded once while with me in the 56th TK. During all these years he became a faithful comrade and friend to me. Of medium height, dark-haired, with beautiful, open brown eyes, alien to all servility. A good athlete, an extremely honest man and an excellent soldier. Always cheerful, he won the hearts of his comrades and superiors. When we landed, I personally took him to the hospital. He underwent an operation, but he had lost too much blood. During the night, that young life faded away. We buried him together with other German and Italian comrades who had fallen at the same time in the Yalta Cemetery, high above the sea, in one of the most beautiful places of this picturesque coast. To honor his memory, I want to place here the words I said over his grave. They have been preserved only because I sent the text of my speech to his parents at that time. We bid farewell to our dear comrade, Oberfeldwebel Friedrich Nagel. You were in your lifetime a fine soldier. Military service was your inner calling. Your deeds and thoughts were guided by the love of soldiering inherited from your father. Therefore, you were brave and full of initiative and sense of duty. You were an exemplary soldier who would have been further promoted if fate had not wished otherwise. You were a great comrade, always alert and ready to help another, and so you won our hearts. You lived your life happily. You were beautifully brought up in the home of your parents, to which you were always attached by filial affection, and you learned labour early, but you set about every task before you, in labour and service, cheerfully and joyfully, and you succeeded in everything you undertook. You perceived the beauties of the world with an open eye and experienced the great events of our time with an open soul. With a cheerful spirit you enjoyed the pleasures of life, but they never distracted you from your duty. Cheerful and always ready to help others, you won the hearts of everyone you met on life's journey. In sun of happiness, success, joy and love illuminated your life path. It was not yet overshadowed by worries and sadness. To your life we can rightfully refer the words of ancient Greeks, who once inhabited the shores where you found your grave. The gods take their favourites early to themselves. For more than 5 years you, my driver and faithful companion, sat next to me behind the wheel of our car. Your faithful eye and your steady hand led us through many countries and many thousands of kilometres. There was never a rift between us. Together we have seen many beautiful things during these years, experienced great events and victories together. Next to me you were wounded last year, next to me the fatal bullet has caught you now. During the days and years of our life together, and common great experiences we have become friends. The ties of friendship that bind us cannot be broken by this insidious bullet that caught up with you either. My gratitude and my loyalty, the thoughts of all of us, will not leave you beyond the threshold of the grave. They will follow you forever. Sleep well, my best comrade. But war does not tolerate stopping even in thought. A few days later, a small task force of the army headquarters left for the Sevastopol front and settled at the CP in the Tatar village of Eupatoria. It was picturesquely located in a deep mountain gorge. Nevertheless, the Soviets apparently did establish that the headquarters with its radio was located here. Every evening their duty pilot appeared with his old sewing machine to drop a few bombs, fortunately without any success. On a rocky peak rising above the village, in the Rocky Mountains of Kerch, where the Goths once built their fortress, we set up our NP. We moved to this NP on the evening of June 6 to watch the infantry advance along the entire front the next day. It was a small earthen dugout from which we could observe with the aid of a stereo telescope. There we, Chief of Staff, Chief of Operations, Chief of Intelligence, and myself, spent the quiet evening hours before the assault. Again, Pipo brought cheerfulness to the tense atmosphere that prevailed. It was suggested to me to issue more orders to the troops, in which it was necessary to explain the meaning of the upcoming battle. I'm not in favour of such proclamations. Usually they're posted only in chanceries, and the soldiers already knew what the matter was, and did not need any encouragement. Certain as it was customary to issue such orders, I set out everything that was necessary in a few words, and gave the order to Papio to bring it to the corps headquarters. In a little while he returned and report. I have passed this paper. It was an impertinence, but in effect he had expressed what every soldier thinks of such appeals. We laughed heartily. The next morning, June 7, when the dawn began to colour the sky in golden tones, and the valleys began to free themselves from the shadows of the night, the fist of our artillery struck the enemy with all its force, heralding the beginning of the infantry offensive, till squadrons of planes fell on the targets indicated to them. An unforgettable spectacle opened before us. It was a unique case in modern warfare when the commander of the army saw before him the entire battlefield. In the northwest we could see the wooded area, hiding from us the heavy fighting on the left flank of the 54 AC, and further heights to the south of the Belbek Valley, for which there were such persistent battles. In the west were visible Gaitensky Heights, behind which in the distance glistened the water surface of the Bay Sever at its junction with the Black Sea. In good weather we could even see the tip of the Chersonese Peninsula, where we later discovered the remains of Hellenic culture. In the southwest, the heights of Sapunra and the cliffs of the coastal mountains rose threateningly. From the entire wide ring of the fortress front at night were visible flashes of guns, and during the day clouds of dust and rock fragments raised by bursting shells and bombs of our aviation. Truly a fantastic framing of a grand spectacle, but stronger than the nature of this iron land, as they rightly called this piece of land, for which such hot battles were fought, stronger than all the means of equipment used by the offensive and defensive, was the strength and selflessness of those soldiers who fought here for victory. And at Sevastopol, not only the advancing army confronted a numerically roughly equal defending enemy, not only modern means of attack, artillery and aviation opposed the fortifications covered with steel, concrete and stone. Here the spirit of the German soldier, his bravery, initiative, self-sacrifice struggled against the desperate resistance of the enemy, whose strength lay in the favourable terrain, in the endurance and incredible resilience of the Russian soldier, strengthened by the iron system of coercion of the Soviet regime. This struggle, which lasted uninterruptedly for about a month in the hottest season of the year, cannot be described even approximately in such a way that this description expresses the tension of forces with which both the offensive and the defensive fought. What our troops accomplished in this struggle is worthy of a heroic epic. Here can be described only in the most condensed form the course of one battle, which in its complexity and tension can hardly find an equal in this war. The command of the 54th Army by forces of the 132nd Division undertook on the right flank of its corps a frontal attack through the valley of the Belbek River to the heights south of it, leaving aside the enemy bridgehead in the area of Lyubimovka. To the left 22 PD had the task, by striking from the east-south of the Belbek River through the Kamyshli Gorge, to provide 132 Division successful overcoming of the Belbek River Valley. Further to the left, 50 PD advancing through the village of Kamyshli was to strike in a southwestern direction. On the left flank of the corps in the mountainous terrain covered with forest, 24 PD had the task of advancing in the direction of Gaitansky Heights. The left flank of this division was covered by the 18th Romanian Division. On the first day, with the powerful support of large forces of artillery and the 8th Air Corps, which made continuous raids on enemy positions, managed to overcome the Kamyshli Gorge and the valley of the Belbek River and gain a foothold on the dominant heights south of the valley. On the southern flank of 38 had the task, first of all, to capture for themselves on both sides of the big Sevastopol road initial positions for the continuation of the offensive, which the corps was to begin its main forces only a few days later. Second stage of the offensive, until June 17, is characterized on both fronts of the offensive by a fierce struggle for every inch of land, for every dues, for every field position. By fierce counterattacks, the Russians are again and again trying to regain lost positions. In their strong strongholds, or even in small dus, they often hold on to the last man. In these battles, the brunt of which falls on the infantry and sapper troops, the work of the artillery forward observers deserves special mention. It was they who corrected the fire with the help of which it was possible to occupy individual strongholds or dus. They, and to an even greater extent, the self-propelled artillery units were the best assistants of the infantry. So on June 13, the brave soldiers of 16P22 Division managed to seize Fort Stalen, in front of which the regiment's advance was stopped in winter. The spirit of our infantry can be seen in the example of one wounded man from this regiment, sprinting to his shattered arm and bandaged head. He says, "It's not so bad, but we have Stalin in our hands." Until June 17 it is possible, though at the cost of heavy losses, a greater depth and in a wide area to cut into the long-term defensive line in the north. The defences of the second line of defence, Chika, Gipu, Siberia, Volga. In the offensive strip of 30ak, by June 17 also manages to wedge into the forward defensive posts of the enemy, advanced in front of his position in the area of Sapunra. In heavy fighting, the 72nd Division seizes the fortified strongholds of the 1st Defensive Zion, northern nose, Mount Capella, Ruina. At this time, the 170th Division occupies Cameri, also to the north of the Corps' offensive line. The 1st Romanian Mountain Division finally manages, after repeated unsuccessful attacks, to take possession of Sugarhead. Meanwhile, the 28th Light Division was moving very slowly with battles in the coastal mountains with steep cliffs, through the Hill of Roses, through the heights Kinovar E and I. The actual battle in the rocky terrain, riddled with deep gorges, can only be conducted on the basis of using the actions of assault groups and is associated with significant losses. But despite these hard-won successes, the fate of the offensive in these days seemed to hang in the balance. There was still no sign of weakening the enemy's will to resist, and the strength of our troops noticeably reduced. Command 54 AC forced to temporarily withdraw from the front 132 Division, replacing its infantry regiments, which suffered heavy losses, Regiments 46th Division from the Kerch Peninsula. Tace of the 46th Division was to be taken by the 24th Division removed from the left flank of the corps. So at the same time, the O carries with the offensive. and considers the question of withdrawing the 8th Air Corps from the Crimean section of the front for an offensive in the Ukraine, if the army headquarters does not count on the rapid fall of the fortress. On the contrary, the army staff believes that the offensive under any circumstances should be conducted until the final victory, but for this it is necessary that the 8th Air Corps was left in the Crimea. The army command manages to defend its point of view, but who could at that moment, seeing how noticeably depleted the forces of our brave regiments, to give a guarantee in the imminent fall of the fortress, since it could be foreseen that the forces of our own infantry would probably be prematurely depleted. The army command asked for 3 infantry regiments to be placed at its disposal, to which the OK agreed. These regiments were to be available at least for the last phase of the battle. In the situation created, both corps, which carried out the offensive, took advantage of the advancing corps to choose at its discretion the area to attack or the direction of the main attack, thus putting the enemy before the fact of surprise. The 54th AC Command, having introduced 213 pp and 24 PD into the battle, turned the front to the west. 213 ppi under the command of Colonel Hitzfeld captured the armoured battery Maxim Gorky I. One of the battery's guns had already been put out of action by a direct hit from a large-caliber battery shell. The other was blown up by our sappers who penetrated into the fort. Still, the garrison of this defensive structure, which had several floors underground, surrendered only after our sappers with explosive charges penetrated into the fort through the towers. During one of the attempts to break out of the fort, the commissar commanding the fort was killed. His soldiers surrendered. After that, the 24th Division managed to capture by June 21 the whole part of the northern section of the front along the western coast, up to the defences protecting the entrance to Sevastopol Bay, which was still in the hands of the enemy. On June 17, in the 38th offensive strip, an unexpected shift in the direction of the main strike also led to an important success. The Corps headquarters decided to suspend the offensive through the northern ridge of coastal mountains, east of Balaclava, and concentrate the Corps forces at the main road and immediately south of it for a surprise attack. From the flanking fire from the coastal mountains here could only protect the return fire of artillery. And indeed, 72 Division managed to capture the enemy positions south of the road. The reconnaissance battalion of this division under the command of Major Bake, boldly using the initial success, passed unimpeded through the fighting order of the stunned enemy to Eagle Heights, located in front of Sapundra. On the morning of June 18, the battalion managed to occupy the heavily fortified Eagle Heights and hold it until the approach of new division forces. Thus, the prerequisites were created for expanding the breakthrough of the enemy's defensive system in the northern direction. Also, in the subsequent third stage of the offensive, battle success was achieved by the unexpected transfer of the direction of the main blow, especially with the support of artillery. In the north, the success was expressed in the fact that the immediate objective of the offensive was achieved, the capture of Sevastopol Bay. In the south, in the fact that we seized the initial positions for the offensive on the Saipun Heights. In the northern section of the concentrated use of artillery leads to the fact that the 24th Division manages to seize the defences of the peninsula dominating the entrance to the base area. Among the captured structures is, however, outdated, but still a powerful stronghold of the enemy, Fort Seveny. 22nd Division in the whole strip of its offensive seizes the rocky heights, precipitating at the northern shore of the bay. Particularly fierce battles for the railroad tunnel at the junction between the 22nd and 50th Divisions. From this tunnel, the enemy undertakes significant forces counterattacks. Finally, by direct shelling of the entrance to the tunnel, we manage to seize it. Not only hundreds of soldiers, but even more civilians, men, women and children, come out of it. It proves particularly difficult to dislodge the enemy from his last hiding places on the north shore of the bay. To house ammunition and reserves, the Soviets have arranged deep tunnels with armoured gates in the steep cliff walls, which have been equipped for defence. Their garrisons, under the authority of their commissars, had no thought of surrender. There was nothing left but to make an attempt to blow up the gates. As our sappers approached the entrance to the first of these caves, an explosion occurred inside the casemate. A considerable section of the rocky bank collapsed, burying the enemy who were in the casemate as well as a group of our sappers. The commander of the casemate blew it up with the men in it. Finally, a lieutenant from one battery of assault guns, who, disregarding the enemy's fire, approached from the southern shore of the bay along the coastal road, succeeded in forcing the enemy to open the remaining casemates by fire from his gun from the closest range on the embrasures of the entrances. The commissars in these casemates committed suicide. Completely exhausted soldiers and civilians came out of the casemates. The 50th Division, which had to fight difficult battles in its offensive strip, which took place on terrain covered with shrubbery, was able to reach the eastern end of Severnaya Bay and seize the Gaitansky Heights, dominating the exit from the valley of the Shinaya River. On its left, troops of the right flank of the Romanian Mountain Corps advanced with fighting through wooded terrain in the area of the heights southeast of Gaitana. Romanian General Lascar, who later died in the Battle of Stalingrad, was the soul of the offensive here. In the 30-ack offensive strip, the suddenness of action achieved by the change of direction of the attack also led to success. Using the above-mentioned capture of Eagle Heights, 72 Division, the Corps headquarters introduced into the battle, pulled up here also from the South 170 Division to take possession of the massive Feodosia Heights. This blow from the south turned out to be a complete surprise for the enemy, whose eyes were turned to the east and who, apparently, was already expecting an attack on the Sapun Heights. Capture Feodosia Massif succeeded relatively quickly. Thus was won the initial base for a decisive offensive on the Sapun Heights. The left flank of the Romanian Highland Corps also achieved success in these days. Thus, by the morning of June 26, in the hands of the 11th Army, was almost the entire outer rim of the fortress. The enemy was thrown back inside the fortress, the northern part of the front of which was formed by steep heights on the southern shore of Severnaya Bay, while its eastern front ran from the heights of Inkerman through the Sapun Heights to the cliffs near Balaklava. The Army Command had to solve the problem of how to break through this inner belt of the fortress. There was no doubt that the enemy will continue to fierce resistance, especially since he, according to the statements of his front headquarters, could not count on evacuation from the peninsula. On the other hand, it was impossible not to recognize that, even if the enemy's reserves were largely exhausted, the striking power of the German regiments was running out. During these weeks I was on the road every day before and after lunch, at Corps headquarters with artillery commanders in divisions, regiments, battalions, and at artillery observation posts. I therefore knew all too well how things were in our units and formation. The regiments numbered several hundred men each. I recall a report of one company withdrawn from the front line, whose fighting strength amounted to 1 officer and 8 privates. How was it possible with these melted parts and units to complete the battle for Sevastopol, when the 54th Army stood in front of Severnaya Bay, and the 30th Army was to heavy fighting for the capture of positions on the Sapun Heights? The most successful in this situation would be to transfer the general direction of the main blow to the southern flank, where the 30 AC. But just this was practically impossible. Such an set of infantry divisions from the northern section of the front to the southern front was to take many days, which gave the enemy the opportunity to rest and come to their senses. After all, there was only one narrow road connecting the two sections in the front line and built by us in the winter in the mountains at the cost of incredible effort. However, it was impossible to transfer artillery of great power along this road. The transfer of the main forces of artillery from the northern section to the southern through Yalta, and providing it with ammunition, it would take several weeks. In addition, the General Command, under any circumstances, intended in the near future to remove the 8th Air Corps from the Crimean theatre of military operations. Immediately after the 22nd Division came to the northern shore of Severnaya Bay, I went to the regiments of this division. From one observation post on the north shore of the bay, I wanted to survey the surrounding terrain. In front of me lay a bay 801,000 meters wide, in which at one time anchored entire fleets. On the opposite side on the right, the city of Sevastopol, directly in front of me, steep coastal heights, dotted with fortifications. The thought occurred to me that from here, that is, from the flank, it would be necessary to destroy the position on Sapunra, as it is in this place, across the Bay Severnaya. The enemy least expects our attack. True, when I discussed this plan at first in the headquarters of the 54th AC, and then with some subordinate commanders of compounds, it was treated with doubt. How was it possible to traverse a wide sea bay and assault boats in sight of the well-equipped and equipped heights of the southern shore? How was it possible to get the assault boats to the shore at all over the precipitous cliffs, to load troops into them, when there were only a few deep gorges through which access to the shore was possible? for the enemy from the southern shore could, of course, view and hold these exits under fire. Still, precisely because an attack through Severnaya Bay seemed almost impossible, it would be unexpected for the enemy, and this could contain a guarantee of success. Therefore, in spite of all the doubts that were expressed to me, I insisted on my plan, however hard it might be to lead such a daring enterprise when, by virtue of my position, I myself could not take part in it. After this decision had been taken, all the staff set about its realization with the greatest zeal. Here I would like to give special praise to the sappers who, along with the infantry, showed themselves to the best advantage already during the battles for the Dome. Early in the morning of June 29 was to begin a general offensive on the inner part of the fortress, in the band 54 ACC through the base of Severnaya, in the band 30 ACCE, on the Sapunsky Heights. Already on June 28, 50 Division managed to force the river Chernaya in the lower reaches and take Inkerman. Here occurred a tragedy that showed with what fanaticism fought the Bolsheviks. High above Inkerman rose a long, going far to the south rocky wall. In this wall were huge galleries that served as wine cellars for champagne factories in the Crimea. Along with large stocks of this drink, the Bolsheviks created here ammunition depots. In addition, they used these premises to accommodate thousands of wounded and fleeing civilians. When our troops stormed into the settlement of Inkerman, the entire rock behind the settlement shook from the monstrous force of the explosion. The wall about 30 meters high collapsed for about 300 meters. Extraordinary tension was experienced by all those involved in the implementation of the crossing of the bay at midnight on June 28, when preparations for the offensive were underway. The continuous bombardment of the city by the 8th Air Corps had to drown out the noise on the north shore of the bay. All artillery was in readiness to open a hurricane fire on the heights of the south shore as soon as fire from there would show that the enemy had figured out our plan. But on the opposite side all was quiet. The difficult launching of the assault boats and their loading succeeded. At 1 a.m. the first echelon of the 24th and 22nd Divisions departed from the northern shore, and the boats took a course for the southern shore. The crossing, which came as a complete surprise to the enemy, was a success. A bold leap across the sea bay was crowned with success. When the enemy defense of the area of the southern heights came into action, our brave infantrymen had already entrenched themselves on the southern shore. Detectable enemy firepower on the slopes of the South Bank heights was destroyed by our fire. Our troops climbed the plateau. Thus was destroyed a seriously threatening position on the Sapun heights. With the first rifle shot began the attack of this position also the troops acting from the front. On the left flank of the 54 AC-50 Division and the newly introduced into the battle 132 Division from the area of Gaetana and south began an attack on the heights near Inkerman and south of it, supported from the flank by artillery located on the northern shore of the bay Severnaya. In this attack included troops of the right flank of the Romanian Highland Corps. Also at dawn went into a decisive attack on the Sapun Heights 30 AC, supported by long-range batteries 54 AC and successive air attacks 8 Air Corps, while the Corps demonstrated by artillery fire offensive on a wide front. 170 PD of this corps prepared to strike in a very narrow strip at Feodosia Heights. The attack was accompanied by direct fire from one anti-aircraft artillery regiment, assault guns, and a 300-tank battalion. The division quickly reached the heights on both sides of the Great Sevastopol Road, utilizing the moment of surprise. It soon seized such a wide area in the north, east, and south directions that the Corps was able to pull its other divisions to the heights. With the successful crossing of the bay, the fall of Inkerman Heights and the breakthrough of the 30 AC Sapunskaya position, the fate of the fortress of Sevastopol was sealed. What followed was the last battle of the army, which could neither change its fate nor bring any benefit to the Soviets from the point of view of the general operational situation. Even for the preservation of the honor of the arms, this battle would have been superfluous, for the Russian soldier had truly fought bravely enough, but the political system demanded the continuation of a futile fight. The divisions of the 54th AIK crossed the bay Severnaya, after occupying the heights of the southern shore were already inside the outer rim, which a large arc encircled the city. Holding this encirclement became, thus, meaningless for the enemy. The corps, having allocated part of the means to attack along the position in the southern direction, turned to the west and began the attack on the position located on the outskirts of the city and on the city itself. The famous Malikov Mound, for which so much blood had been shed in the Crimean War, fell into the hands of the Corps. It represented part of the position on the outskirts of the city. In the meantime, 30 AC still on June 29 quickly pulled up, following 170 Division, its 28 Light Division and 72 Division, which had the task of demonstrating the offensive on a broad front. Now the divisions from the springboard gained by the 170th Division on the Sepun Heights were given the task of advancing in radial directions to capture the Chersonese Peninsula. The 28th Light Division, having captured the English cemetery, broke through the outer defensive outline southeast of Sevastopol. The Soviets equipped the English cemetery as the main stronghold of their outer defense line. The marble monuments that had once been erected to the dead British soldiers were destroyed. The new dead lay by the shell-turned graves. Next, the division began to advance westward, leaving the town on the right in order that, should the town be defended, it might be captured from the west or prevent an enemy force from breaking through in that direction. The object of the 170th Division's attack was the lighthouse on the western promontory of the Chersonese Peninsula, at the spot from which Iphigenia may have looked, seeking with her soul the land of the Greeks. The 72nd Division was striking along the southern coast. Clearing Saponskaya position in the southern direction, it first seized the dominant over the whole area height windmill, and thus gave the Corps the opportunity to use the big Sevastopol road. It was followed by the 4th Romanian Mountain Division, which, striking in the rear, captured the still defended by the enemy defensive system around Balaclava. At the same time, the division captured 10,000 prisoners. Having studied from experience the actions of the Soviet command, we assumed that the enemy would offer the last resistance at the position located on the outskirts of the city, and finally in the city itself. Stalin's order to hold on to the last man was radioed to Sevastopol again and again. We knew that all the inhabitants of the city capable of bearing arms, including women, had been enlisted to defend the city. The army command would have acted criminally towards the soldiers of its army if it had not taken this circumstance into account. The struggle inside the city demanded new heavy sacrifices from the advancing army. To avoid this, Army headquarters gave orders to give the artillery and the 8th Air Corps one more word before the divisions would again move against the city. They were to show the enemy that he could not count on forcing us into street fighting to inflict further bloody casualties. The day of July 1 began with a massive fire on the outlying fortifications and inner strongholds of the city. The shelling was successful. After some time, scouts reported that no serious enemy resistance was expected. The firing was suspended. The divisions went on the offensive. Probably the enemy on the night of July 1 withdrew its main forces from the fortress to the west. But the fight was not over. The Maritime Army, it is true, left the city, but only for the purpose of trying to put up new resistance in the positions that covered the Chersonese Peninsula, perhaps in fulfillment of Stalin's orders to fight to the last man, or in the hope of taking out at night, on Red Fleet ships, at least part of the army from the deep bays west of Sevastopol. But in reality, only a few of the top commanders and commissars, including Commander General Petrov, were taken out on torpedo boats. His successor was detained in the Black Sea by our torpedo boat while trying to escape in the same way. The final battles on the Chersonese Peninsula lasted until July 4. The 72nd Division captured the armoured DOS Maxim Gorky Yin, which was defended by a garrison of several thousand men. Other divisions increasingly pushed the enemy to the very end of the peninsula. The enemy made repeated attempts to break through at night to the east in the hope of connecting with the guerrillas in the mountains of Yela. In a dense mass leading individual soldiers under the arms so that no one could lag behind, they rushed to our lines. Often ahead of all were women and girls Komsomol, who also with weapons in their hands encouraged the fighters. It goes without saying that the losses in such attempts to break through were extremely high. Finally, the remnants of the Maritime Army tried to take refuge in large caves located in the steep banks of the Chersonese Peninsula, waiting in vain for their evacuation. When they surrendered on July 4, only from the area of the extreme tip of the peninsula came out about 30,000 men. The enemy's losses in manpower exceeded ours several times over. The amount of captured spoils was enormous. The fortress, protected by powerful natural obstacles, equipped with all possible means, and defended by an entire army, this army was destroyed. The whole Crimea was now in our hands. From an operational point of view, the 11th Army was freed just in time to be used in the big German offensive on the southern section of the Eastern Front. On the evening of July 1, I and my closest assistants from the headquarters task force were at our command post, a small Tatar lodge in Eupatoria, the Soviet night duty airplane, which until then had always dropped a few bombs on our valley in the evening, did not appear anymore. In our minds, we were reliving the battles of the last months. We thought of our comrades whose graves were now covered with green grass. Then we heard on the radio the sounds of victory fanfares, which began a special message about the fall of Sevastopol. The following telegram was then transmitted to the commander of the Crimean Army, Colonel General von Manstein. With gratitude noting your special services in the victoriously conducted battles in the Crimea, crowned by the defeat of the enemy in the Battle of Kerch and the capture of the powerful fortress of Sevastopol, famous for its natural obstacles and artificial fortifications, I award you the rank of General Field Marshal. By awarding you this rank and the establishment of a special badge for all participants in the Crimean battles, I before all the German people pay tribute to the heroic deeds of the troops fighting under your command. Adolf Hitler. It is understandable that we, who worked and fought so long months to achieve the final victory in the struggle for the Crimea, and knew better than anyone else, on what a thin thread hung at times the fate of the 11th Army, in this hour were filled with a sense of pride and joy. What a unique experience it is to savour the feeling of victory on the battlefield. But if the Marshal's baton as a sign of a victoriously conducted campaign meant the crown of my military career, I still did not forget how much soldierly luck is needed to achieve such a goal. Some people do not manage to crown themselves with the laurels of the winner only because he is either too young or too old. But what are these honours worth in comparison with the burden of responsibility borne by one who, together with the command of an army, is at the same time responsible for hundreds of thousands of lives and you at least in part, for the fate of his country? Above all, however, in that hour my comrades in arms and I thought that it was thanks to the devotion, bravery, steadfastness and sense of responsibility of our soldiers that all difficulties were overcome and victory was achieved in the campaign which the 11th Army, left to itself, happily ended. So, true to German soldiering traditions, it fought nobly and chivalrously. After our task was completed with such a victory, I felt an inner need to say a word of thanks to my fellow soldiers. I did not have the opportunity to see all of them to shake their hands. I therefore invited at least all the commanders, down to the battalion commanders, and all those non-commissioned officers and privates who held the Knight's Cross, or the German Golden Cross, to a solemn act in the park of the former royal palace at Levadia. First, we honoured the memory of comrades who gave their lives to pave our way to victory. The evening dawn sounded. The power of love and our silent prayer rose to the sky. The last beat of the drum was replaced by the song of the good comrade, which was perhaps nowhere more true than in the fighting in the east, a farewell salute to those whom we had to bury in Crimean soil. Our glorious comrades. I then thanked all the soldiers of the 11th Army and the 8th Air Corps, as well as those who could not participate in this celebration, for their devotion, bravery and steadfastness, often manifested almost in a critical situation, for all they had accomplished. In conclusion, we all gathered for a modest dinner, which, however, did not go entirely quietly. Several Soviet airplanes coming from the Caucasus treated us to bombs. Fortunately, everything was without casualties. Of course, after the fall of Sevastopol, I received a lot of congratulations, but 3 presents gave me special joy. After we had gathered late in the evening of July 1, upon receipt of the Führer's telegram, on my conferring the rank of Field Marshal, and the establishment of the Crimean Shield badge for the 11th Army to celebrate this event in our Tatar cottage, on a small open veranda, our chief of the intelligence department, Major Eisman of the General Staff, left for Simferopol at night. There he raised from his bed one Tatar, a goldsmith, gave him his silver watch, and ordered him to make 1 pair of Marshal's staffs for my epaulets by morning from the silver contained in the watch. When I appeared for breakfast on July 2, the staffs, finely engraved, were lying in my place. It was a touching token of affection, and for that reason it gave me great joy. I soon received a small parcel. The sender was the German Crown Prince. The parcel contained a heavy gold cigarette case. On the lid was skillfully engraved plan of the fortress of Sevastopol with all its defences. On the inner side was inscribed the name of the high donor. I was especially touched by the words of the accompanying letter. The Crown Prince wrote that he was not destined to master in his time Verdun. He is all the more pleased that I managed to occupy the powerful fortress of Sevastopol. These were the words of a kind man, a true comrade. A third gift was peculiar. A Russian priest who had fled from the Bolsheviks to France and now lived in Vichy sent me a thick cane. It was made of knotted grapevine, with a topaz embedded in the shaft, and on a narrow metal ring was an inscription in Russian. In the letter, the priest wrote that his grandfather, during the Crimean War, as a regimental commander, participated in the defence of Sevastopol. He was severely wounded in the leg, and the soldiers of his regiment made him this cane. Overjoyed that I had taken Sevastopol and liberated Crimea from the Bolsheviks, he, a priest, wanted to send me this cane as a token of gratitude. I also received 2 books in red leather bindings. They were memoirs of a certain General von Manstein, who in the time of Empress Anna, while in the Russian service, had fought under Field Marshal Minich on the shores of the Black Sea. Although I was connected with him only by name, and not by blood relation, yet the reading of these memoirs, written in French, was of great interest to me, not to mention the fact that I had followed, so to speak, in the footsteps of this Manstein, fought on the same fields. The memoirs were also interesting from the point of view that they described a life of adventure. After the accession of Empress Elizabeth to the throne, Manstein had to flee Russia, while his patron Minich went to Siberia. Both together had once overthrown the true ruler of Russia, Duke Byron of Coron. When Minich was travelling in a sleigh to Siberia, he met the Duke returning from there. Both noted in the memoirs politely, like knights, greeted each other. Manstein, after fleeing Russia, entered the service in Prussia. In the Battle of Kolin was severely wounded, and during his return home was killed by the Pandurs, to whom he did not want to surrender. Vacation in Romania. While at the end of the fighting in the Crimea, our troops got a few weeks of well-deserved rest in the wonderful area of southern Crimea, where the fruit was already ripening. I could also afford a vacation. Marshal Antonescu, who visited us in the summer after the battle on the Kerch Peninsula, made me an invitation to spend a vacation with my wife in the Carpathians as his guest as soon as the fight for Sevastopol was over. He extended his invitation in a friendly manner also to our eldest son, who, after fighting in Russia and studying at a military school, had been promoted to lieutenant in the spring and needed a vacation after suffering from scarlet fever. We had the opportunity during these weeks to recognize the wonderful Romanian hospitality. It is true that the intended vacation turned out to be more or less an official visit. When we arrived at the Romanian border as ordinary travelers, a saloon car was already waiting for us. A Romanian general and a representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs greeted us as guests of the Marshal and the government. After a wonderful ride through the Carpathians, we arrived the next day at Predeal, a climatic resort high in the mountains near the famous royal castle of Sinai. In Predeal, Marshal Antonescu had a magnificent villa. We were met at the train station by Mrs. Antonescu and the Romanian Minister of War. A guard of honor was lined up with a company of Marshal Antonescu's Guards battalion. Interestingly, the Marshal had his own Guard battalion. The Marshal's battalion was similar to the King's Guard battalion in everything, with the only difference being that the King's battalion had white eatiskits, while the Marshal's battalion had red ones. Through the flag-decorated streets, on which the schoolboys formed trellises, we drove to a lovely little villa, which served as a residence for the guests of the government. It accommodated my wife, our son, who arrived a few days later, and myself, while Specht and the 2 Romanian officers placed at my disposal were ensconced in a neighbouring house. We were very kindly received by Mrs. Goga, the wife of the former deceased Prime Minister and an intimate friend of the House of Antonescu. She had previously owned the house, and she showed us the well-furnished rooms. Living room, dining room, too. She also introduced us to the villa staff and said quietly, but insistently, that we could well rely on the cook. This reminded us that we were in the Balkans. Indeed, Prime Minister Goga, who had adopted a German-friendly course, had been poisoned. When, during our stay, Marshal Antonescu fell ill with a mild stomach upset, the first thing he did was to calculate the cook. In general, we were kept as the apple of his eye. 2 German and 2 Romanian criminal police officers always followed us discreetly. Back in the saloon car, we only with difficulty managed to persuade a Romanian official, who had been ordered to sleep on the floor in front of the door to my compartment, to choose a somewhat more comfortable place. It was the first and only time in my life that I was received with such honours and guarded with such care. It requires a special habit. The life of a mere traveller is certainly more comfortable. During our stay in the Predeel, we were several times on a visit to the Marshal's house. He and his wife spoke excellent French and were most gracious hosts. Antonescu had long been military attaché in Paris and London. His pro-German stance was all the more pleasing. One day we were invited to breakfast with the king and his mother, Queen Helena. The queen was still a beautiful woman, amiable and intelligent, natural, and at ease in conversation. She longed for Florence, where she had lived for years at the time when her husband, King Carol, was in love with Madame Lupescu. It could be seen that the queen had Hohenzollern blood in her veins. The young King Mihai then gave the impression of a somewhat helpless and indifferent man. His inclinations seemed to be entirely centered on automobiles and motorboats. While the Queen Mother showed interest in political matters, the king seemed cold or disinterested in his task as ruler. For his age, he rather gave the impression of a disillusioned man. Was it already then a mask? His immaturity was surely due to the fact that he spent his childhood between an intemperate father and a mother who lived mostly abroad. Added to this was the fact that Marshal Antonescu had removed him from all practical work related to running the country. The young king did not even know how to behave when he had to visit a military unit, and it happened quite rarely. On another occasion, we travelled through Transylvania accompanied by Romanians and visited the cavalry school in Hermannstedt. Antonescu was at one time the head of this school and therefore took special care of it. It was exemplarily equipped, and the riding demonstrated to us was of a high standard. We also accepted the invitation of the Romanian Patriarch and visited him at his rural residence, located near the monastery amidst a marvellous forest. Like all Orthodox priests, he and his younger companions wore beautiful long beards that emphasized the dignity of their ministry, talking with a highly educated pastor who had studied geology in Ereslavol and Tübingen was a great pleasure. In the evening we sat on the terrace of a modest rural house, and our food was simple and modest in a rural way, in contrast to the treats at secular ceremonies. But the most pleasant impression during our stay in Romania was our visit to the Germans living in Romania, who, under the regime of Antonescu and under German influence, enjoyed much greater freedoms than in former times. Incidentally, the widespread name Transylvanian Saxons is a misnomer. Transylvanian Germans came here from Luxembourg and Lorraine. We toured the wonderful Transylvanian province. The day began with a service in one of the old fortified fortress churches. They were still protected by walls behind which the inhabitants had taken shelter during the war, and to which were attached animal stables and food stores. The Bishop of Transylvania conducted divine service. Peasants with their wives and children, all dressed in old-fashioned, colourful attire, hurried from the surrounding villages. Then began our trip through the beautiful villages with their rich estates. Flags were displayed everywhere, and school children greeted us with flowers in their hands. We visited Marienburg Castle, which is the predecessor of Marienburg Castle in Prussia. The German knightly order, forced to retreat from the Holy Land, was first given the colonizing task in Transylvania before it came to Germany to then conquer Prussia for the Germans. In the afternoon we attended the baptism of a German boy, of whom I became godfather. At the christening, in a circle of peasants proud of their farm and their beautiful homeland, everything the host had was served. After lunch, in another village we took part in a village festival, during which young girls and boys in motley folk costumes showed us their beautiful old-fashioned dances. It was a marvellous picture. We spent the evening among the Germans in the main German settlement of Kronstadt, the pride of which was the large so-called Black Cathedral. This name was due to the walls of the cathedral blackened during the fire. The last days of our vacation we were in Bucharest. We saw the oil fields of Ploiești, a Romanian military factory, and I also visited a military hospital. The hospital was housed in a luxurious building that the royal court had built for its employees. At the outbreak of war, Marshal Antonescu, not thinking long, had taken this building from the court and turned it into a hospital. However right this action was in itself, the rudeness and straightforwardness of the marshal made many in court circles his enemies. One day applies to the following fact. One day the marshal suddenly dismissed the entire entourage of the Queen and replaced it with other persons. Major Rosetta, the son of a diplomat and brother-in-law of General Paulus, was also a victim of this replacement. Later he came to me as a Romanian liaison officer and became a good mediator and comrade. Undoubtedly Marshal Antonescu did himself a great deal of damage by the fact that he completely excluded the king from state affairs, although he was not yet sufficiently prepared for this, and also by the fact that he used such crude measures. At any rate, whoever saw the king at that time would never have thought that he would ever have had the courage and initiative to arrest Antonescu, that he, the representative of the Hohenzollern dynasty, later betrayed Germany, thus foreshadowing the end of his rule, was then still hidden in the darkness of the future. So be that as it may, we can only look back with gratitude on those weeks when we were able to experience wide Romanian hospitality and when we had unforgettable experiences in German Transylvania. Now the Germans, who had not undergone expulsion from that province, were enslaved. The only thing that gave me joy was that my godson and his parents had escaped the wave of extermination that threatened them and were now living in Hanover.